Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. This is the first time I've been speaking at a Jerusalem Center event, but it is not the first time I have been in this room. Looking around this room and the rooms across the hall, I remember endless hours spent here on this level of the David Citadel in negotiations with Saab Erekat and Mohammed Daklan and James Wolfenson. Nevertheless, I agreed to come. Unpleasant memories of this geography. If I had a title for these remarks I want to make, maybe even for the whole conference, I think the title would be Back to Basics, because that is, I think, the exercise in which we are engaged. Dory and others have talked about the Bush statement of April 14th, 2004. What was new in that statement? What were the new elements of that statement? I would argue there was one new element, and the rest was a return to the key elements of U.S. policy since 1967, elements that were developed under President Johnson. The idea that there would be no return to the situation before June 1967. Dory is absolutely right about the April 14th letter. It was not a letter that President Bush dreamed up one morning and dictated to his secretary. It was a document negotiated between the United States and Israel at great length, carefully, line by line. And the occasion for it, April 2004, was Gaza and 4 settlements in Samaria. That is to say, in December 2003, Prime Minister Sharon had announced his intentions. He then spoke to the Likud party. There was a political battle in Israel. It is correct that he was receiving no compensation from the Palestinians, as this was a unilateral move, because as Prime Minister Sharon said, I want it to be unilateral. I don't want to be in their hands. But the compensation that he needed, not least for Israeli political purposes, was to come from the United States in the form of solidarity with Israel and the policies adopted in that letter or expressed in that letter, and then endorsed by the U.S. Congress. The heart of the approach is, as people have said today, that Israel has the right to defend itself, a phrase that you heard many, many times from President Bush after incidents, Rantisi, Yassin, incidents in Gaza, incidents in the West Bank. The line that he gave to the American spokesman was, Israel has a right to defend itself, and, as the letter put it, the United States reiterates its steadfast commitment to Israel's security, including secure, defensible borders, and to preserve and strengthen Israel's capability to deter and defend itself by itself against any threat or possible combination of threats. Defend itself by itself. And here I agree completely with what General Amidror was saying. What's critical is there's no talk in this letter about international guarantees or international forces. We are all familiar. He gave some examples. We're all familiar with the experience of UNIFIL. We were familiar with it then, 2004. Of course, we have more experience because UNIFIL was strengthened in 2006. It was enlarged in 2006 after the Lebanon War, and it has now presided over a massive rearmament of Hezbollah. What are the key elements in the Bush approach to Israel defending itself? First, the continuation of the U.S.-Israel alliance, including military aid from the U.S. Secondly, Israel's borders. You can find plenty of comments from President Johnson to Secretary of State Schultz, who has been here in Jerusalem, to many others, that the so-called 67 borders were incapable of defense and would change. I say so-called because the April 14th letter makes no reference to 67 borders. It refers to the 1949 armistice lines, which was another effort to show that these were not borders and that they would need to be adjusted. Now, that is not really new. As I said, I think that comes from President Johnson in '67. What's new, something that did come from Bush, was the clear statement that developments on the Palestinian side, namely the replacement of a corrupt terrorist leadership with the capability and the willpower to fight terrorism, was central. If you remember the language of the roadmap, which, as Dory says, we were all supposed to be bound by to this day, it didn't say fight terror. It said dismantle terrorist organizations. This was, the language of the 2004 letter was a follow-on to what President Bush said in June of 2002. He said, I'll read this 4 or 5 sentences because it's a reminder of what the US policy was. I call upon them, the Palestinians, to build a practicing democracy based on tolerance and liberty. If the Palestinian people meet these goals, they will be able to reach agreement with Israel and Egypt and Jordan, very interesting in the 2002 speech, and Egypt and Jordan, on security and other arrangements for independence. And when the Palestinian people have new leaders, new institutions, and new security arrangements with their neighbors plural, the United States of America will support the creation of a Palestinian state. Nobody remembers this 2002 speech, whose borders and certain aspects of its sovereignty will be provisional until resolved as part of a final settlement in the Middle East. A Palestinian state will never be created by terror. It will be built through reform. That was new. That was a change. The understanding that peace was not going to be made as it had been made with Jordan and Egypt, because Israel and the Palestinians were more deeply intertwined. Security for Israel depended then also on what happened inside Palestinian society. That is why we are required to be concerned about whether the PA arrests Hamas or Fatah terrorists, and whether they broadcast on Palestinian radio and TV vicious libels of Israel and Jews. This argument about what we've come to call incitement is not trivial. It is not marginal. To use a historical analogy, England and France could not have made peace with Germany, didn't make peace with Germany at the end of World War I, because that was a Germany with which only a false peace could be made. Only after the changes in German society after World War II could a real and lasting peace be made. Same goes for the United States and Japan. Here, the location of the border and what is on the other side of that border are equally important. Now, this position can be caricatured. You know, this is an attempt to impose American political institutions on the Palestinians, or it's a phony argument. It is a demand that perfect democracy must arise in the Palestinian territories before any negotiation is possible. But that is a caricature. All that President Bush said was that they need institutions of statehood that carry on a serious struggle against extremism and terrorism, a physical struggle and a political and ideological struggle, not any particular constitution or basic law, but a decent political system where the terrorists and their supporters are not in control, where those who are in charge of education policy want a 21st century economy, not nursing ancient hatreds. That's reasonable. And in some of these areas, there is progress. And we heard about the Palestinian police a few minutes ago. I think it's misleading to Palestinians and Israelis to deny that there is progress. But Israel should not back away from what is now called the incitement issue because it is a security issue. Similarly, those who back away from defensible borders are making a huge mistake. Presumably they do so because they think defensible borders is too much to ask for. We need to promote peace. There will be no peace on the 67 lines, as has been understood actually since 1967. Clarity about that, clarity about the fact that those lines will change actually promotes peace. The point is not horse trading. The point is not punishing the Palestinians. The point is to reflect reality on the ground and establish a basis for a peace that can last. Now, I've said I think the Bush policy was mostly a return to the policy of we've had since 1967. I therefore think that American policy today is a departure. It's a new and much worse policy. We see it on the question of settlements. We see it on Jerusalem. We see it, unfortunately, on the entire relationship with Israel. We saw it. We don't even have to mention the flotilla in Gaza. We saw it a few days ago in the Non-Proliferation Conference, the NPT conference, where the U.S. departed from a long-time policy, and policy that was very clear in 2005. The Washington Post had an interesting take on this, which I should read to you. The Washington Post reported on Monday, not that the conference lacked for drama. Many diplomats expected the U.S. would kill the final document because of the mention of Israel. When the United States accepted it, the Iranian delegation was so surprised it asked for a 4-hour postponement of the final session so that members could call their governments, diplomats said. In other words, even Iran was amazed that the U.S. would abandon the bipartisan policy of so many years to allow that resolution that singles out Israel and doesn't mention Iran. And what was gained by this maneuver? Nothing. The Washington Post also reported, quote, the United States got few of the specific goals it sought at the conference, close quote. So what happened here was that a serious bipartisan policy about Israel's security was subordinated to a word, I apologize to the translators, it's the right word, was subordinated to globaloney. The question is, how does Israel face up to this problem? What does Israel do? And my answer is, as I said, just back to basics. Stick to the basics, and what is most basic is security. Most of those basic elements are found in that 2004 letter endorsed by both houses of Congress. The administration has been smiling more recently and meeting with rabbis and Jewish leaders, Jewish members of Congress. Israeli diplomats can also smile and meet with rabbis and Jewish leaders and members of Congress, and they should speak to them about defensible borders, the indefensibility of the 1949 armistice lines, proved repeatedly by history, and what are the fundamental security conditions that will promote peace in the region. Avoid, in these conversations, too many tricks and complications. When it comes to negotiations with the Palestinians, I think Israel should insist on negotiations with the Palestinians. With the Palestinians, alone in a room. You can do this without George Mitchell. We had several rounds. We had several rounds of tripartite negotiations in the Bush administration, and they failed. Why do they fail? Because both parties, the Israelis and Palestinians, play to the American diplomats rather than seriously negotiating with each other. I think everyone understands also that real, serious positions are not going to be given away long in advance to third parties, but would only emerge in face-to-face negotiations. Similarly, and despite Senator Mitchell's apparent belief that we are meeting here in Belfast, this is not Northern Ireland. These are not the Northern Ireland negotiations, and there cannot be a time limit on negotiations. The relevant time limits will emerge from Israeli-Palestinian discussions. The problem with the Obama administration has been its policy, not its explanations of policy, and I think the situation with Israel has been the exact opposite. Often the policy has been serious and admirable, and the explanations have been poor. As if somehow many in Israel were embarrassed to be staking out tough, clear, unshakable positions to defend Israeli security. Don't do that. For one thing, you make it far easier to find supporters when your own positions are clear. For then, your friends can understand that these were positions taken by all governments here, Labor and Likud and Kadima, by prime ministers left and right, and supported by presidents of the United States left and right for decades. So I conclude where I began. Back to basics and no apologies.